Today we're going to continue talking about disturbance in succession. These slides are up on the Moodle site. At the end of class last time, Dr. Judd was talking about how successional pathways don't always take the path that we expect them to after disturbance, and so I'm going to begin there. But before I do that, I want to talk about our plant and animals of the prairies first. So our prairie grass of the day is Poa pratensis, Kentucky bluegrass. It is a C3 grass. We haven't yet talked about the differences, the main differences between C3 and C4 photosynthesis in detail, but you should know that C3 grasses are sometimes referred to as cool season grasses. It's because they like cool, moist environments for growing. That's when they grow best. When it gets hotter and drier, they tend to not do so well. These are also sometimes referred to as early season grasses because early in the season it's cooler and drier and they tend to thrive at that point in time. Here in the Midwest, as it gets warmer and drier throughout the summer, these things tend to decline and C4 grasses will take over in many cases. It's a pretty common pasture plant. If you go into any old field here in the Midwest, you're going to see this particular species that is oftentimes planted as pasture for animals. It is once again rhizomatous. What does that mean from last time?
Fire resistant, right?
It grows out fire because it
That's case.
Roots, the living part of the plant is underground.
It's underground, and the meristem is underground, and it grows up from the meristem as opposed to dichotomous plants that have their meristems at the tips of the stems. And it's a perennial plant, meaning that it lives multiple years. Prairie forb of the day is one of the golden stars, Liatris punctata, the dotted blazing star. All the blazing stars have this long flowering stalk that they put up. They produce hundreds, if not thousands, of seeds every year, and they're fluffy, wind-dispersed seeds. It's in the family, once again, in the family Asteraceae. You're going to see a lot of flowers. A lot of the flowers that are on the prairies are in this family. This is a family that generally has these disc flowers with petals on the outside of them. It's a C3 plant as well. It looks kind of like a grass in that the leaves are long and lanceolate, but it's not a grass. It's actually a non-grass species.
Just so you understand what's special about the Asteraceae, those little pink individual florets, each one of those is homologous to, or the equivalent to, an entire sunflower head. So there's many, many flowers, and then the stalk is composed of many of those heads.
Yeah, and I have a number of these growing in my front yard, and they've just set seed not long ago, and so every couple of days as they start flowering. They start flowering at the top and then flower down, and so each day a different stalk of the whole inflorescence is kind of dried out enough, and so we've been pulling the seeds out and dispersing them around sections of the yard where we want more blazing stars, and there are just tons and tons and tons of seeds because inside of each of these things, as Dr. Judd was saying, there's multiple flowers producing multiple seeds, and there are hundreds of these flowers up and down this flower stalk.
Watching them bloom is kind of like imagining a sparkler burn, because they bloom down the length of the...
Yeah, and some plants bloom from the top down, some plants bloom from the bottom up. There's another plant in my garden, lead plant. It starts blooming at the bottom and blooms to the tip of the flowering stem. The prairie animal of the day, a lot of times we get focused on big animals, big showy animals, but things like grasshoppers are super important in prairies. So this is Phytaliodes nebraskiensis. That's a wide-ranging grasshopper species. Grasshoppers have these heavy mandibles that allow them to eat the very tough grasses that are there. All of these grasshoppers have these heavy mandibles. They are prodigious in terms of their reproduction. They produce 140 eggs per individual. They lay these in the upper layers of the soil. It takes about they'll generally lay these in early spring, and they'll hatch in late May in Kansas. takes about 2 weeks for them to go through the incubation stage for the eggs. And one of the nice things about this for this case study is that when you burn a prairie, the prairie's soil is exposed, prairie soil is warmer, and as a result, the developmental time of the eggs is speeded up. So hatching is faster in burned prairies as opposed to unburned prairies.
Have you ever had one of those grasshopper suckers, like with grasshoppers in it?
A what?
Like the suckers, they make the grasshoppers in it?
No, why would I want to have a sucker with a grasshopper?
I just figured that sounds like something you'd do. I mean, you did like
No,
a
that sounds
centipede.
terrible.
Like the centipede was
I mean,
for
you did
science.
A millipede, actually.
Millipede, but
Millipede.
still, those for science, not for eating a
All right.
possum.
So today, what I hope that you get out of today is not stories about suckers and grasshoppers, but explaining. You should be able to explain how disturbance and succession interact, and specifically, I want you to be able to do that in the context of resource-based competition. So we're going to go back and revisit competition models. We'll talk briefly about the Lockwood-Volterra models, but then after that, we're going to look at competition in a different way, a way conceived by this guy named David Tillman back in the early 80s. Be able to model resource-based competition in the same way that we modeled competition in a Lockwood-Volterra sense. The nice thing that you will be happy about is that we're not going to do it mathematically. The math is considerably more complicated, so we're going to do it completely graphically. And then be able to compare and contrast different models for how communities get assembled and what leads to different kinds of community structure. And all of that is in the context of this idea of disturbance interacting with succession. So since Dr. Judd already kind of introduced this idea, I thought I would change tacks from what I normally do and tell you a story about how disturbance changes landscapes and succession sometimes turns out in ways that we don't expect them to turn out. So I worked in Puerto Rico for a while. I did a postdoc there from 98 to 2000, and then I went back for almost 20 years doing research there. And so if you look at hurricane history in Puerto Rico, the big hurricanes that have happened in the time that I've been alive and back before that, the big hurricanes were Hurricane Hugo in 1989 and Hurricane George in 1998. But prior to those two hurricanes, the last really big hurricanes that Puerto Rico experienced was Hurricane San Ciprian in 1932 and San Felipe in 1928. And so between San Ciprian and Hurricane Hugo in 1989, there was this 57-year gap where Puerto Rico existed without experiencing a major hurricane. They would get occasional tropical storms, category 1 and 2 hurricanes, but they didn't get any category 3, 4s, or 5s for a while. And that's after a brief period when they had, over the course of 4 years, a category 5 hurricane and a category 4 hurricane. I meant to put a map in here and then I forgot to do it. We'll go to Google Earth really quick. So you can kind of see the area that I'm talking about. Puerto Rico is off in the Antilles. It's one of the 3 greater Antilles, or 4 greater Antilles, I guess, if you include Jamaica. When you look at Puerto Rico as a whole, you can see that there's this green area over here, and that is the Luquillo Mountains, and that's where I worked. And if you zoom in, and let's do some historical imagery, because this is unfortunately too updated because of a recent hurricane.
So did you live on that mountain where you worked, or did you stay somewhere else?
Yeah, actually I did for a while.
Is it hard to like find stuff? Like,
Pardon?
was like it doesn't seem like it's inhabited. So was it?
Oh, it's
hard
not. So
to
one of the
find-
things that you'll notice is that you can see urbanization coming up, and you can actually see the outline of the protected boundary of the Luquillo Mountains. So it's a national forest, but it's a national forest that is devoted within the Forest Service to primarily research. And I lived on this side of the mountains at a field station that I can't seem to find for some reason. Oh, I don't want the village of El Verde, I want the field sta- oh, there's the field station. So for a time, I lived in what was an old plantation because this used to be old coffee plantation. This is a recent photo. This is recovered forest after Hurricane Maria that happened back in 2017. If you go back in time, remember that in a fully functioning version of this, you can see that forest cover was considerably thicker back before that's what happened after Hurricane Maria in 2017. So when you look at this whole area, it's very much forest, except for the times when the forest gets destroyed by a hurricane. So this is after a hurricane, this is before a hurricane. Very green as opposed to very brown. Anyway, when people look at hurricanes, when ecologists think about hurricanes, one of the things that we think about is the effect of the forest. So this is a fisheye photograph I took in Puerto Rico in undisturbed forest, and this is a fisheye photo looking up in a canopy after Hurricane George in 1998. I arrived in August of 1998, and the hurricane hit in September of 1998, and kind of restructured what I did as a postdoc to a certain degree. And so this is kind of what the forest looks like. This is palm forest, kind of high elevation forest in Puerto Rico, but what you see basically is just nothing but unbroken trees. And after all of this time, between San Ciprian in 1932, and Hurricane Hugo in 1989, during this 57 years, the forest had grown up, had gotten old, the trees were getting old and beginning to just die because they were coming to the end of their natural lives and things like this, such that when Hurricane Hugo hit in 1989, it basically blew the forest down like matchsticks. If you talk to researchers who worked at the site back in 1989, they basically say the forest just looked like somebody came in and scattered a bunch of matchsticks on the landscape, and these are the matchsticks. These are the dead trees that were killed as a result of this hurricane blowing through. To get a better view of it, this is what a tropical forest looks like after it's had the majority of its trees blown down. And so what happened, so the Luquillo Experimental Forest has an LTR site, a long-term ecological research site, just like Kanza is a long-term ecological research site. These are National Science Foundation grants that get funded in 6-year blocks because National Science Foundation realized that to study ecosystem science, you need more time than the typical 2 to 3 year research cycle for a grant. And so they set up this system in 1980. Kanza was one of the first LTR sites to be put up, and Luquillo became an LTR site in 1988. It was founded in September of 1989. About a year into their funding cycle, they got hit by Hurricane Hugo, and they originally wanted to study the food webs in the Luquillo Mountains, a tropical food web that is going to be more complicated and more diverse than a temperate food web because there are more species there. But they very quickly retooled themselves to study the effect of major disturbance on tropical forests and how these tropical forests recover. And then they got a new grant in 1994, and in this new grant there was a new set of experiments that were in the new grant that were hurricane specific. And one of these had to do with Cecropia. Cecropia is an early successional species. What do we mean when we say early successional? successional basically means that it's one of the first species to appear after after a disturbance. And in this case, when we're talking about hurricane disturbance, if those of you who have been to my office, you might have seen hanging up on my wall, there's a cecropia leaf, an old brown cecropia leaf that I brought back from Puerto Rico. These leaves are huge leaves. They are designed to gather a lot of light, and these cecropia trees are fast-growing early successional. So cecropia, they tend to grow fast. As a matter of fact, they grow so fast that their trunks are hollow. They don't even invest energy in making their trunk stronger by putting a lot of pith in there. They basically grow really fast. They have thin limbs that are hollow, and they produce a lot of seeds as they grow. So they're fast growing, high reproduction. They're taking advantage of this opening that they have in a forest. So you'll find cecropia growing back whenever a tree falls in the forest. Normally trees fall for all kinds of reasons. They die and they rot, and eventually they fall over, and they take adjacent trees with them, and it creates a light gap, a fairly frequent, small scale, not very intense disturbance, but it creates that light gap, and oftentimes you see cecropia growing up in those light gaps. The seeds for the cecropia have been laying around in the seed bank. We've mentioned this word a couple of times now, but a seed bank just refers to all of the seeds that have entered the soil during all of this successional time that has been going on. So there are these cecropia seeds hanging out in the seed bank, and when they get enough light, they are prompted to germinate, and they germinate, and you get these stands of cecropia in light gaps. Well, after Hurricane Hugo, there was cecropia everywhere. Like basically the forest went from a regular forest in the Luquillo Mountains to literally a forest of cecropia. Once again, if you talk to the people who were there at the time, it's like it just became a forest of unbroken canopy of cecropia. And so this guy named Nick Brokaw, who is a researcher there in Puerto Rico, he didn't expect this to happen. He didn't expect this cecropia forest to grow back in place of the forest that was there. But one of the cool things about cecropia is with all of these thick leaves and all of this dense growth, what does this do to light availability at the forest floor? It really decreases light availability. Underneath that cecropia stand, it's cooler, it's moister, it's shadier, and so shade-tolerant trees can grow there.
So these shade-tolerant trees grow under the cecropia, right?
Yep. So they provide an environment that allows shade-tolerant trees to germinate. If those trees weren't there, shade-tolerant trees wouldn't germinate because it would be too sunny. Shade-intolerant trees like cecropia grow up in light gaps. But after Hurricane Hugo, basically the whole forest became a cecropia forest. It created an environment that allowed shade-tolerant trees to germinate, and new seedlings came up, and eventually those new seedlings grew taller than the cecropia trees and shaded those cecropia trees out, and over the years, cecropia became less and less and less common because cecropia is a early successional shade-intolerant species. And so cecropia kind of set the stage for these shade-intolerant trees to germinate, and then those shade-intolerant trees ultimately grew up, blotted out the sun, and drove away the cecropia. So in the 1994 grant, Nick put a hypothesis. These grants are big. They're millions of dollars for 6 years, and the one that I wrote was $4.2 million for 6 years of work. And he had this hypothesis in the 1994 grant that was all about going in and removing cecropia from plots so that you could look and see what the trajectory of succession would be if cecropia wasn't there. And so I got there in 1998 in August. The hurricane came in 1998 in September, and the first thing that Nick did was he got on a plane and came to Puerto Rico. And he laid out some plots that he was gonna go out and measure, and some of those plots, when the cecropia came up, he was gonna go in and cut those cecropia down and then look at how the vegetation community changed in places where we had cut cecropia out and in places where cecropia were free to roam. Guess what happened?
Cecropia came back.
No,
No?
cecropia didn't come back.
Huh.
No cecropia came up. There weren't these big, long stretches of cecropia that you could put plots into and remove the cecropia. He went hiking all over the forest for like months, looking for big enough stands of cecropia that you could actually study them, and he ultimately failed to find enough cecropia to work with, to do this experiment where we could see, well, what happens to a forest if there's no cecropia there? Well, guess what? Hurricane George came in September of 1998 and showed us what happens when you have a forest recovering without the benefit of cecropia. So one of my questions to you is, what happened to the cecropia? Yeah,
A
Jackson.
big enough seed bank wasn't developed.
Probably over that 9 years, there wasn't a big enough seed bank developed that you had this flush of cecropia. And so what happened, well, so that's one thing that happened. The other thing that happened is, this is only a 9-year-old forest at this point. And I was there during 1998, and it was plenty devastating, but it wasn't like matchsticks on the ground. But I think I have a picture. This is taken about 6 months after the hurricane on a ridge, and you can see that there's some cecropia. So this is cecropia growth after 6 months. This is maybe a 40, 50 foot tall tree after about 6 months of growth. These things grow really fast. But you still have a lot of the structure of the forest is still there 6 months later, and it's because the trees didn't blow down. They got branches broken, they got defoliated, they lost all of their leaves, but the trees were, to a certain degree, still standing because these trees weren't very old. And what might have also happened is not only was there maybe not enough time to build up a seed bank, about 57 years to build up a seed bank, but if the trunks of the trees are still left standing, what do those trees do very quickly after you take the leaves off of them? Those leaves grow back. When those leaves grow back, it creates what type of environment? A shady environment, and that shady environment is not conducive to early successional trees that rely on high light levels in order to grow back. So here we have two disturbances that were very similar. A Category 4 hurricane, a Category 3 hurricane. They're hitting the same plot of land in 1989 and in 1998. What's different about the two forests that they hit? One's an old forest that is already senescing. Big wind comes, blows a lot of those already old failing trees down. It hits a 9-year-old forest in 1998. Those trees bend in the wind, they lose branches, but then they grow back their foliage relatively quickly afterwards. You have the same kind of disturbance hitting two very different forests. As a result of the hurricanes hitting two very different forests, you have two totally different patterns of succession that occur afterwards. In ecology and ecosystem science, we refer to this as contingency. And Dr. Judd gave you this term last week. You did, I recall you saying that.
It's good to point it out.
You might have missed it. What do we mean when we talk about contingency in processes like this? What do we say when something is contingent on something else?
Depending on it.
Okay, something to a certain degree is dependent on it. Would you have gone to college if you had crappy grades in high school? No, probably not. They wouldn't have let you in. So your entering college is contingent on you doing well in high school. If you want to get a good paying job, that's going to be contingent on what?
Getting a degree.
Probably doing well in college and learning the things that are necessary for you to learn so that when you get out, someone will hire you to do whatever that is that you've been training for. So contingency also acts in ecosystem science in that what happens after a disturbance is largely contingent on what that community was like before that disturbance came into that environment. And so in this case, each hurricane is different. So one of the things that I learned very quickly when I was there is that we talk about hurricanes as just big windstorms, but there are different kinds of hurricanes. Some hurricanes are high wind and very little rain. Hurricane Hortense, which hit Puerto Rico during the time that I was there, a couple of years after Hurricane George, it was a really low wind hurricane, but it had a lot of rain, and it wasn't moving very slowly, and so it just sat over the Luquillo Mountains and just rained for days. Hurricane Hugo was gone in under 48 hours. Hurricane George was gone in under 48 hours. They blew through the island, left a path of wind, caused devastation behind them. Hurricane Hortense stayed and sat over the Luquillo Mountains and just rained for 4 days. That high rain event, a lot of trees didn't die, they weren't blown down, they weren't broken, but we had a lot of landslides because of a lot of rain. So hurricanes are different, but then you can have the same kind of hurricane hitting the same forest at 2 different time periods. In Hurricane Hugo, it blew all the trees down. In Hurricane George, it blew the leaves off the trees and broke branches, but left the trees standing. And as a result, the path of succession after those 2 events was very different. And Nick never got to do his experiment. And here's the thing, as we get more and more hurricanes, and the hurricanes that we get are bigger and stronger, we get more opportunities to explore different paths of succession, because as you know, this is the El Verde Field Station. My office used to be right there. This is the El Verde Field Station in August of 2017, and this is the El Verde Field Station in October of 2017. And so once again, we have another opportunity to study the effect of large damaging windstorms on tropical ecosystems, but we have to recognize that this is now, what's 1998 from 2017? 19 years. So this is now 19 years after Hurricane George, the last really big hurricane to hit. So now this is a 20-year-old forest, which is different than the 9-year-old forest, which is different than the 57-year-old forest that was there during Hurricane Hugo. All of these forests we should expect to respond in different ways because they're striking different forests. This idea of contingency. You need any more explanation to understand what I mean when I use that term. Okay, cool. So once again, when we think about disturbance, Dr. Judd gave you these 2 definitions last time. These are different somewhat, but the things that you need to take home as commonalities between these 2 definitions are the fact that it's punctuated or discrete. A disturbance is something that happens at a time, over a relatively short period of time in most cases. It creates opportunities for new individuals to come in, and it does this, and it's most explicit in the second one. It does this by basically creating changes in resource availability. And I'm going to come back to resource availability because the kind of competition that we're going to talk about in the way of modeling competition today is going to be all about modeling resource availability and the resource needs of organisms. So it's something that happens that creates ecological space, and that ecological space is largely done by removing some individuals from the community and allowing space for other individuals to come in. And a lot of this is done through the process of altering resource availability. So he walked you through this successional pathway, the way I learned about succession when I was an undergraduate. You start off with annual plants, you get perennial grasses, you get shrubs, you get trees, you get hardwood trees, and then a hurricane or something comes through, blows all of this down, and you go back to some earlier stage of succession. And then you march back through these steps and you end up with the same forest that you had before the disturbance came. And this is called a sear. this sequence of change in a community, and each of these stages is a several stage. Annual plants, perennial plants and grasses, shrubs, softwood trees, hardwood trees, disturbance, go back, reset, progress through, end up at hardwood trees again. This is the classic view of succession. You may get knocked back in successional time, but then you go through these successional stages and you end up at the climax community, this idea of the climax community that was put forth by a guy named Frederick Clements. We'll be revisiting Clements later on today. And I forgot any dates. 16, I think it was 20. Yeah. 2 books that he wrote about plant communities, where he put forth this idea that plants have these discrete sort of communities that you can find over and over and over again. And he also advocated for this view of succession, where when a disturbance comes, it knocks you back in successional time, but then you go through these several stages and you end up back at the community that you ended up with. And evidence, there was lots of evidence to kind of point to this, because you could go to the Indiana sand dunes that Dr. Jett told you about. You can see these communities repeating themselves over and over again on the successional landscape of the sand dunes. You guys ever play around on Google Earth?
No.
You need to develop this pastime. You can kill hours doing this. I, at one time, where did it go?
You can test your vegetation knowledge using GeoGuessr, where it puts you in a random spot and you can look at the sky and the vegetation and guess where you are on the planet.
And speaking of which, we're going to go to South America. If you go to South America, you can start in the village of, or the city of Pucallpa, which is now much bigger than it was when I was there in the early 90s. But you can go back, you can go up the Ucayali River. So this is the Ucayali River. It's a muddy river. It flows out of the Andes. It's one of the 2 upper tributaries that make up the Amazon. So in Iquitos, the Ucayali River joins up with the Marañón River coming out of the Andes, and they join together outside of Iquitos to form the Amazon. But when you zoom in on these turns in the riverbank, what do you notice about this?
There's sandbars that form.
Okay, so right here where the river is bending in here, there's a sandbar. What's going on hydrologically with this river in this bend? It's going around the bend.
Pushing like land up.
The
Towards
velocity of the river is faster here than it is here, so it's cutting into this bank because it's moving fast. And because it's moving slower here, what is it doing? It's depositing sand and silt and things. So it's building new land right here while it cuts into land over here. And so here you have sand because not enough successional time has passed for plants to grow in and things like this. And then you get the beginnings of succession. And you can see that there are these semicircular bands. And finally you get to over here, what starts to appear? You start to get small trees and shrubs and things like this. So if you look at these bends in the river, you see this pattern repeated over and over and over again. You can see early examples of it in old oxbow lakes that have been left behind by the river. This is an oxbow lake. The river used to run here, but you can see these patterns of succession still in the landscape. And so you have these repeated patterns over and over again, which led Clements to conclude that succession happens along a particular pathway, and you end up at the same spot at the end of that successional pathway, regardless of where you begin. Guess what? Clements was not particularly correct on this front. So Dr. Judge showed you this graphic where we can illustrate the path of succession involving communities of species 1, species 2, and species 3 as they change over time. Some disturbance takes you back to the beginning, and then you go through this pathway again, as opposed to a situation where you go through this successional pathway, you end up at some climax community, but when a disturbance comes, it doesn't knock you back onto the trajectory that you were on before, it knocks you onto a different trajectory, and the pathway of that different trajectory is going to lead you to a different climax community at the end of that successional trajectory. So you don't necessarily get to a climax community, a disturbance comes, knocks you back in successional time, and you're on that same trajectory you were on before, and then you grow back into that same community. You may end up growing into a different community altogether, a different combination of species altogether. This is a more modern, I would argue, probably more accurate way of thinking about succession than the sort of Clementsian view of succession. So, yeah,
So for
Jackson.
Clement's like theory of climax unity to be correct, you'd have to have like the same, like for example, going back to the Puerto Rico example, for Hugo and George, since it was a 57-year-old forest and a 9-year-old forest, if George would have came 57 years after Hugo, like it did, would they been the same like climax community?
Maybe, but in what other ways have things changed in those 57 years? What are some things that might change the path of succession? It's a good question. What other things might change the path of
Climate,
succession?
human population,
Hmm?
like human influence.
Growth of the human population, perhaps. What else?
I said
Urbanization.
Climate.
Change in climate might favor some trees or some plants because it's now warmer. It's 2.5 degrees warmer at the El Verde field station now than it was in the 1970s. 2.5 degrees centigrade warmer at El Verde. There's a series of papers that came out looking at lizard thermoregulation using the thermometer. One of the nice things about having a long-term ecological research station, this was actually a forest research station back in the 1960s before it became an LTR site, so they've been basically monitoring temperature there since the early 70s. Actually using the same thermometer in the same box, essentially, for that entire time, placed in the same exact position. And so it's heated up 2.5 degrees centigrade since the 1972, I think, is the date that they started doing this.
So the thermometer still works, like.
Yeah, it's also been replaced by an electronic thermometer, but the old mercury thermometer is still in there. And has amazingly enough survived hurricanes, all the hurricanes since then. Yeah, were you gonna say something?
No.
Jackson, okay. What else might change? Yeah,
Could you have another disturbance of another kind?
you can have another disturbance of another kind. One of the things that we found that we used to not study in Blue KO LTR is we used to not study fires. As it turns out, people would go into the forest and they would create fires to make charcoal, but they made those in pits. So you can make charcoal by burying wood in a pit, setting it on fire, and then denying it oxygen. And so there are charcoal pits, and you run across these if you're doing work and you have to plant some plants as part of your experiment, and you'll hit a charcoal pit and you're like, oh, I can't work here because this is affected by human land use in the past. The place where we work used to be coffee plantation. I think I told my lab group about walking through the forest, and you can tell where the coffee plantation was and where the undisturbed forest is because there's a trail that goes on the boundary between the two. And if you close your eyes and listen to the bird species, there's a different community of birds on one side of the trail than there is on the other side of the trail. It's the difference between coffee plantation on the right-hand side and undisturbed forest on the left. So there's this imprint of human land use on the forest there in Puerto Rico, which has brought things in like coffee plants. You can still find occasional coffee plants as you're out hiking around. Not enough to do anything with, but they're still there existing in certain parts of the forest. What other things have happened? Think biologically, because urbanization might or might not be affecting it, but certainly not in this place because there's no urbanization being allowed. Yeah.
Didn't you say there was like a change in diversity after the hurricane of plants?
So yeah, diversity does change, but in Clement's way, the diversity that you would get after the disturbance would be the same diversity with the same actual species that you had earlier on in succession in that forest, but that's not necessarily the case. Yeah.
Species are growing as time goes on, so an increase in the population could have an impact.
Okay, so all the community structure is basically made up of a number of different species, and the community that you see at any given time is made up of those species. What are humans doing with species? It's a problem on this campus, actually. If you look out this window, come and look out the window if you can see. Can you see out the window?
Yeah, these windows.
Oh, they've gotten rid of a lot of it. But one of the things that you'll see is growing all along the ground there is a plant called winter creeper. It's a crawling plant, it's a creeping plant. It will actually grow up trees and kill the trees. Winter creeper is what kind of species? How do we define winter creeper? It's an invasive species, so humans bring in new species that didn't live here, and those new species can have an effect on things. In the case of winter creeper, it kills off canopy trees if you leave it and let it go unchecked.
You had to wear like booties over your shoes when you walk through, or no?
Through where?
Like clothes over your shoes?
No,
Oh.
no, it just kills them and denies them of nutrients and strangles them and feeds off of them, and it's just
No, I was
terrible.
asking when we went into the forest, did you have to wear things?
Oh, no, no, that's in Hawaii. No, this is a totally human impacted forest in Puerto Rico. So you can also have a contingency in that you can have a disturbance hitting an environment at one time that has relatively few introduced species in it, and then a disturbance comes by at a later time in an environment where there are more introduced species. Oftentimes these introduced species are of the early successional type because people want their plants to grow, they want them to grow quickly. I just planted a willow in my yard. One of the advantages of planting a willow is it grows like gangbusters. So, lots of things can affect the path of succession. But what I want to talk about today is when we go from an environment that looks like this to an environment that looks like this, what happens to resource levels? When you think about the resources that organisms need, what are some of those resources? And what happens to the levels of those resources as a result of disturbance? Write a couple of ideas down on a piece of paper or on your iPad, and then when you have some ideas about what those resources are and what happens to them after disturbance, consult with the other members of your group for a few minutes. What resources are affected by disturbance and what happens to those resources as a result of that disturbance? So think about what a resource is. Okay. I need to please. Everybody say that.
some of them will decrease, and then because there's more time, like other resources, other ones will increase.
Like they're initially low, like right
The
after the
point
stairs,
I
and eventually like
I'll make
ecological
is
space
that,
is filled
so
up
I
with
noticed
more
your
resources.
mostly pretty hard.
I said there's an increase in nutrients in the soil, so like in hurricane.
So, carbon, phosphorus, and
It's like
those all
destroying
increase in the soil after.
like the food sources for certain, you know,
herbivores. And now, I don't know how,
still being moved back in.
I imagine to the soil, it allows things die, which allows for decomposition.
Essentially,
Increases
like if you
soil.
think like agriculture, like after you farm so much corn on a piece of property, you have to put soybeans on that same property to put nitrogen back into the soil. So it's kind of,
So you're thinking resources decrease?
Basically, it just.
it's bad, but it's still, it's good.
Yeah.
Nutrients back into the ecosystem. And it also
Okay.
there's different things about the shelter. There's a giant decrease
How long is it?
in the shelter
Depending on
ability,
the resource you're talking about.
especially like birds and insects and stuff like that.
And because of that.
What's
that
not
was, like,
super abundant
the birds
here,
to move to other
there's now
spaces.
super abundant here.
I said space increases, so like there's a lot more space because you.
Other way around.
Opposite.
How the
Plants and
hurricane
animals
decreases.
from the space, so then you open up more space for new species.
Yeah, that's kind of what I.
And when you think about space, don't just think
Also
about
for
physical
animals,
space,
I
also think about resource space.
Increased shelter.
So if there's a species
Yeah,
out
yeah,
there
the
that,
shelter in there.
that needs a lot of nitrogen in the soil, a plant species that needs a lot of
In
nitrogen
my
in the soil, if you get rid of another species that needs a lot of nitrogen in the soil, that creates ecological space for nitrogen, high nitrogen supply needing plant to come in
I
and
have to
colonize there. And if it grows a little faster than
because
the
I
other species, it
can't
can
have
drive that
this.
species
There's
to
so much
extinction
cost popping
in
out
that,
of this.
in that little
Like
area.
I've cut myself out twice.
Simply because there's less demand on nitrogen
It's
now.
not gonna.
So
this is
think
like my
about
phone's it's already
space
failing me.
in a very
It's already failing.
meta sort of way.
So like,
The
like
physical
it's
space
super
can
slow. It
also
shuts
be
down on me all the time. It dies really fast.
nitrogen
And, like,
space,
my
phosphorus
brain's like,
space, sunlight space. So
take
how
it.
much of those resources are being
The
utilized versus
AT&T
not
were asking me
utilized.
to take it to AT&T.
I said light also increases.
Yeah.
Doing
You
good.
alright?
Alright. When we look at these two photos,
Depends on a lot of things.
this photo here and this photo here, the first thing that should jump out at you is that if you're a plant, you're gonna be competing way more for sunlight in this environment than you are in this environment. And this goes back to those cecropia plants. Those cecropia plants need high light environments in order to survive, so they're gonna survive well in this environment, and they're not going to be surviving as well in this other environment. What were some of the other resources you guys talked about? Yeah, Jack?
We talked about shelter, like for birds and insects. And
So physical space,
Yes.
endangered, yeah, are you about to do that? Yeah. There's an endangered parrot species in Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rican parrot. It lives in these mountains. It actually lives in old trees that are on the verge of dying, and they're already endangered. And when a hurricane comes through and knocks down trees, it knocks down the places where they can build nests, and so it reduces nest availability, which then just imperils them even more. What else did you think about? Yeah.
The death of a lot of organisms, I don't know why I couldn't think of that word, will allow for decomposition, which will increase like soil richness. with
Okay, so
all the fun stuff.
that decomposition releases the nutrients that are in
Yeah.
the dead plant bodies that are there decomposing. In theory, raising soil nutrient levels. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Rachel, you had something.
Also, talking about like chemical nutrients, the trees that can like hog the nutrients. And then
Okay.
release it.
So if you have some species that are more resistant to whatever that disturbance is, they have now an environment where there's less competition. They can pull resources up out of the soil, and if that then depletes the soil, then it can make it harder for other species to come in. Yeah.
We also talked about just the soil in general, because new soil, that soil might be blown away or new sediment might be brought in. Like, if there's a,
If you're in a forested ecosystem that is on a mountainside, like a covered brook in the northeastern United States, you have a deforested watershed. What's happening on that deforested watershed without all those trees? Erosion. Water is trickling through the soil. You guys know what happens as water trickles through the soil?
Carbs, like,
Hmm?
makes it,
So that's erosion. There's something of something different.
and like carbs, like makes it look different, like.
That's once again erosion. I'm looking for something different.
Coffee.
Is water a polar molecule or a non-polar molecule?
Polar.
It's a polar molecule. Luke's like, oh my god, he's going off about polar molecules again. I did this all during genetics last spring. What does it mean when we have a polar molecule?
Electronegativity is different.
Different charge on each side of the molecule.
Okay?
There's higher.
Give me specifics.
There's higher affinity of one element in a compound. Like water, for instance, the hydrogen or the oxygen is very electronegative, pulling the element more towards the oxygen. So
Pulling what towards the oxygen?
towards
The electrons.
The
So if you
electron,
envision this
yeah.
as a covalent bond with 2 electrons here.
electrons of.
When an element is spoken of as electronegative, what that means is it likes to attract electrons to it. Not that elements like anything, but it tends to attract electrons to it. It pulls the electrons of hydrogen closer to oxygen. Because this is a terrible way of illustrating molecules, because around this molecule of oxygen, or around this element, this atom of oxygen, and around this atom of hydrogen, there's a single electron, but this electron is zipping around in space. And we represent it as a dot because it's a particle. It has both particle and wave-like properties. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 electrons zipping around oxygen. 2 of those are not available for bonding, but 2 of those are available for bonding. And what oxygen tends to do is it tends to pull the electron cloud of hydrogen away from it. And so the 1 proton of hydrogen is now exposed. It's more out there and not surrounded by the negative charge of the electron. And so hydrogen takes on a partial positive nature, and oxygen takes on a partial negative nature. When we think about soil nutrients, what are the soil nutrients that we usually think about as plants needing a lot of? Nitrogen in what form? In the form of nitrate. Does nitrate have a charge?
Yeah.
Yes, it does. It has a negative charge. What about phosphate? It also has a negative charge. What about potassium? It has a positive charge. When water trickles through soil, because it is a polar molecule, it has a partial negative end and 2 partial positive ends, it can latch on to negatively charged particles, negatively charged molecules, ions, in soil. By hooking up with the partial positive, the partial negative oxygen can hook onto the positive potassium. And as water flows through the soil, what also flows through the soil? These nutrients. When they flow through the soil and they hit bedrock, they start flowing laterally and they flow into streams. What do they carry with them? They carry with them all those nutrients. So one thing that might happen when you do a disturbance like deforestation, or you have a disturbance like a hurricane, where you knock down a bunch of trees or remove those trees from the landscape altogether, is while you might have decomposition adding nutrients to the soil, you also have this process of leaching, which you may have heard about before. But this process of leaching is this process of water drawing these nutrients out of the soil, because water is a polar molecule. Those of you taking chemistry right now, you need to remember electronegativity, and you need to remember what polar molecules do and how they interact with other molecules, because that's super important for certain things in ecology. It's also super important for things in cell molecular biology and genetics. It's these polar molecules that set up transient bonds with other molecules that are important for a lot of biological and ecological functions. So of all the lessons you learn in chemistry, learn this lesson in chemistry. It will come back to haunt you over and over and over again. So this is Hubbard Brook. It's another forested ecosystem. Back in the 1960s, the Department of Agriculture, the Forest Service, decided that they were going to do an experiment to see what the role of plants are in determining things like nutrient cycling. And so what they did was they cut down some tracts of forest and left some other tracts of forest intact. They suppressed the regrowth, they suppressed succession by spraying herbicides over the cut watersheds. So here is a cut watershed being sprayed with herbicide from a helicopter. Obviously, they had a lot of money to do this. And this is an adjacent uncut watershed. Look at these trees. What do you notice about those trees?
Leaves are pretty much only at the top.
Leaves are pretty much only at the top. What do you think leads to that pattern?
Is that a water?
Competition for someone.
Yes.
Competition for sunlight. Why not put leaves all the way down the trunk?
Lower leaves don't matter.
Because once you get a certain depth into the forest, there's no light left over because all those leaves at the top have used it all up. And so you don't invest in leaves down here because that's just wasted energy because they're not going to be doing any photosynthesis anyway. So it's definitely possible to think of light as a resource. And in this case, it's a resource that from the looks of this forest is pretty heavily competed for. So what they did was they kept these watersheds that they had cut bare. This is what their whole experiment looks like. In some cases they deforested places, in other cases they deforested it in strips because it's a forestry kind of project, they want to know what happens. Well, one of the things that happens is this is one of the cut watersheds. Watershed 2 is a cut watershed. This is before the deforestation and that is after. Look what happens to stream flow. This is precipitation divided by stream flow. What happens to stream flow in this case? In watershed 2, the black squares. It does vary from year to year, but what happens in the winter of 1965 into the spring and summer of 1966? These are yearly totals. It gets a lot closer to precipitation. So these are precipitation. This is stream flow. All of a sudden, stream flow is really high, and it's virtually the same as precipitation. Water's falling into the landscape, and water's exiting the landscape via stream flow. As that water leaves the terrestrial environment and moves into the aquatic environment, what is it carrying with it?
Nutrients.
It's carrying nutrients with it. So one of the things that you might expect to happen in systems that have been disturbed is you might expect them to have fewer nutrients rather than more nutrients, because after the cut and during this period of suppressed regrowth, calcium is exported out in stream flow, potassium exported out in stream flow, nitrate exported out in stream flow. This represents the area when vegetation regrowth was suppressed. This is a reference watershed that was not deforested. This is watershed 2. And you can see that during that time when plants aren't there to take up the nutrients that are in the soil gets attached to water, water flows through the system, and gets pulled out in stream flow. As soon as you stop applying herbicides, what starts happening to the export of nutrients out of this ecosystem? It slows down, and after just a couple of years, it gets back pretty close to the reference watershed, because now there are plants that are absorbing those nutrients, keeping them from being leached out because they're actually being used to build new plant bodies. Yeah, stuff to hand back.
Thank you.
We'll take this up next time, and we'll be continuing this discussion. We're going to be talking about how these resources then affect the path of succession.